Creamer Media's Mining Weekly is interviewing Pieter Veldtman, the Corporate Finance Director of Bridge Capital Advisors, who served as an advisor to Copper 360 on the listing of the company on the AltX of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange earlier this year. Hi, Pieter. It's great to chat to you. Why, in your view, was it financially advantageous for Copper 360 to list on the AltX of the JSE?
Hi, Martin. Thanks. Yes, it's always good to chat to you. And good question to start with. I mean, I think definitely yes, financially advantageous. The company had a requirement for growth capital. There was a small SXEW plant in operation, but the business model needed significant new capital to build out the concentrator plant and also to develop the entire ship property and its prospects. And the quantum of capital, bearing in mind that there'd already been significant investment capital raised from principally the management team, suggested that the listing was a viable option. As always with the JSE or AJSE listing, you access investors with mandates that require a listed environment. And that was important for us to gain access to those additional pools of capital.
Do you foresee the listing continuing to be advantageous for Copper 360 in the medium to long term?
Oh, absolutely. There's significant growth opportunities within the business that's still to be unlocked, and in all probability that would require access to additional funding. Not all of the opportunities would be able to be unlocked over the short to medium term out of operational cash flow. And we've already seen some very positive SENS announcements detailing upgrades in the resource. There's a drilling program that continues. So we're likely to see more news on that going forward. And I suspect there'll be opportunities to raise more capital through the listed instrument.
And why did Copper 360 decide to sell shares only to invited private placement investors?
Oh, Martin, that's a good question, but not really a tricky one. As you well know, a very significant portion of our retail investor base really get access to the JSE through some form of contractual savings. My pension fund, likely yours, other forms of annuity savings. We really trust that in the hands of professional investors. And from an advisory perspective, it's easier to access those pools of capital. There's fewer people to deal with, and it becomes quicker to execute. But I think important to note, it doesn't exclude the retail investor. We simply participate indirectly.
And how did Copper 360 arrive at a placement price of R4 per private placement share?
Martin, the dark art of valuations. That's probably a story and a series of articles all on its own. As advisors, we like the discounted cash flow methodology, and we base that on management forecast and estimates. But in the case of a resource listing, you also have the added benefit of a competent persons report on the resource, and that arrives at its own valuation using a range of prescribed and allowed methodologies in terms of the SAMRAC and the SAMVAL codes. And then, of course, always the ultimate part of the art is to make sure that you price it at a level where you're certain that you'll have support from key investors. And you know, in combination, that's kind of where the R4 comes about.
And what is your comment on 90 million rand of the 152.5 million raised at an oversubscription rate of 1.3 times being committed by ICAPA Consortium and Coronation ahead of listing?
It was great for us and the team to see support and significant support at that from two credible institutions. ICAPA brings, in my view, significant strategic value, being a mining investor and operator themselves. And Coronation has been a long-term supporter of the company. In fact, they were investor in the business prior to the listing. So it was very gratifying to see very good demand in a tough market. There'd been very little recent capital markets activities, so we weren't sure exactly what to expect. I mentioned earlier it was, after considering alternative options, it was the right time and the right environment for the company to seek a listing on the JSE. And I suppose, as always, credit to the management team and the founders. They have a great asset assembled over a number of years. They've committed a significant amount of their own capital into the project. They've assembled a good team around them, and they're in a space, copper, that's got very visible growth expectations thanks to electric vehicles and renewables in particular. There's an angle of sustainability in terms of the reprocessing of older mining dumps and tailings facilities. And of course, they're in an area of the country that where job creation and access to sustainable jobs is a massive issue. And I think all of that needed to come together in terms of creating success. And kudos to the team, really, to have the vision to attempt what they're doing.
And did the JSE, in your view, live up to Copper 360's expectations?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We found them to be very proactive and supportive throughout the process. They were accessible. We had a number of one-on-one and team interactions with them, and it was a pleasure to work with the team at the JSE.
And what steps can be taken now to make it easier for retail investors in particular to buy Copper 360 shares going forward?
That's a good question, that, Martin. I'm not sure we need to take new steps. I mean, there's any number of platforms through which retail investors can gain access. The likes of Easy Equities decide to trade on their own if they don't wish to have that indirect benefit through their contractual savings. And it's up to retail investors to do their homework and access the share.
And what, in your view, Pieter, should be the biggest takeaway from the listing of Copper 360?
Well, I think there's a lesson in the listing itself, Martin. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem that must come together. As in nature, if the ecosystem works together, it's a recipe for success. In this case, there's a management team, there's a story, there's an investor base, there's a series of advisors, there's the regulators, commentators like yourself, and all of us need to play our role and make that ecosystem work. But ultimately, I think it's a great story. It's a beautiful opportunity. You have a credible and experienced management team, and with those combinations, you'll always gain investor support. And bearing in mind, the listing is not the end game. It's actually the start of a new phase of growth and a phase of unlocking value for stakeholders, and hopefully a phase of growth where the JSE will play its part and allow the company to access additional rounds of capital going forward.
That was Creamer Media's Mining Weekly, speaking to Pieter Veldtman, the corporate financial director of Bridge Capital, which advised on the listing of Copper 360 on the AltX of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange.